Inspiration for Teachers podcast, bringing you dynamic and inspirational educator interviews. Our fascinating guests share their professional challenges and creative resolutions for success. Discover their workable strategies, ideas, and resources to reach your educational goals. And now your host, Kelly Long.
Welcome to another episode of Inspiration for Teachers podcast. I'm your host, Kelly Long, and I thank you for joining me on another episode here today. We're in the Creativity and Innovation series, and I have a very exciting guest joining me on the show today, Dr Alison Pease. Alison is the lecturer in computing within the School of Science and Engineering at the University of Dundee. And Alison is joining me on the show today because we're going to be diving into computational creativity. So I'm really excited that we're going to go there because I'm sure she's going to give us some great advice as to what we can do when it comes to computational thinking and creativity, and give us some kind of ideas as to how we could try to think about teaching that. Thank you for joining me on the show today, Alison.
Thanks for having me.
It's a real pleasure that you're joining me here today, and I can't wait to get into this with you. It's going to be fantastic. So just before we do dive into all of that, could you just take a moment to say hello to the listeners and give some background as to what you've been doing in education and what makes you our expert on the show today?
Hi, yeah, okay. So I started out, my first degree was in mathematics and philosophy, and then I trained as a secondary school teacher and taught both of those subjects and Spanish at secondary schools and sixth form colleges. And then I went back into education myself and trained in artificial intelligence. So I brought those things all together. And since I've finished my PhD and done several postdocs, I've got a lectureship. So I now teach computing, as you said.
Wow. So we're going to be talking about computational creativity here on this episode today. But just before we dive on into that, Alison, I just want to take a moment to thank our sponsors of the show. My Revision Pal is the online revision system for exam success. Many students struggle with revision, getting started, overcoming the mindset barriers, or even knowing what is an effective revision strategy. Students can learn how to pass their exams using My Revision Pal's online revision system. This 6-guided learning module program teaches students how to pass their exams using the 2 scientifically proven and most effective revision techniques. By the end of the program, students will feel more confident, be more focused, and will have the revision skills and systems in place to pass their exams. Right now, students can enroll for free and experience the first learning module. Head over to myrevisionpal.com. That's myrevisionpal.com and sign up to experience your free trial. Okay, great. So, Alison, let's start off by talking about what is computational thinking and creativity. So let's just assume that none of us know what it is. So could you just give us a breakdown as to what exactly is it and what are the challenges surrounding it?
Well, computational thinking in general relates to artificial intelligence. So this is about components of intelligence, and we usually model on human intelligence, but we also include animal intelligence or social intelligence, and aspects of that is possible to provide an algorithmic interpretation of it. So in other words, simulate those aspects on a computer, on a machine. So the sort of aspects that I'm talking about include reasoning, intuition, maybe emotions, understanding, perception, imitation, movement, learning, all of the things that we do all of the time, including creativity. So creativity is an important part of intelligence, and computational creativity is a subfield of artificial intelligence.
And why is it important?
Well, it's so people have different motivations for wanting to study it. Having a computational perspective can help us to understand how we ourselves operate. So there's a mind as machine kind of metaphor where we see how people do things, and then and lots of different disciplines look at this, like psychology and cognitive science, philosophy, and so on. But what artificial intelligence can provide is a way of operationalizing their theories of how people are able to be creative, and then evaluating the theories, so testing them by running a system and seeing whether its input and output matches what people are doing. So that's the ultimate way of testing a theory, and provides a new perspective on the way in which we think ourselves and we are creative ourselves.
I was thinking about what you were saying there about most of it is modelled on human behaviour, and you said about how humans are creative in their thinking, and I find that really interesting because when you talk about creativity, you know, and especially you've probably seen it yourself at secondary school and sixth form and when you're lecturing as well, lots of people can really struggle with creativity and creative thinking. So it must be a real challenge to try and create artificial intelligence that thinks creatively.
It is a struggle, yes. It's not an easy problem at all. But I would question whether people find it hard. I think so. Young children, for example, are creative all the time. You see, I don't mean necessarily big domain-changing creativity, like creating the next type of music or, you know, a huge new piece of art that's, you know, creates a new genre, but small things like just inventing new ways to use something or slightly changing the rules of the game when the game gets a bit boring. And young kids do this all the time. And I think older people do that as well in different ways. We re-represent things, we're flexible in our thinking, we're imaginative. So I think that everyday sort of creativity is more common maybe than you're suggesting. But all the same, it's definitely a difficult problem. And I don't think anybody would claim yet that we've been able to build a machine that's creative.
Can you give us some examples of what it is that you've been doing about computational creativity in action and some of the benefits that you've uncovered by investigating it and some of the conflicts that you may have discovered?
Sure. So one of my interests is to build systems which can be autonomously creative themselves and interact with other creative people in a creative way, in a collaborative way, in order to develop something. So my particular interest is in how new mathematics is developed. So how is the stuff in the textbooks thought of? How do people invent these ideas? So I study how people interact and build up mathematical theories and explore concepts and think of examples and so on, and then build systems which hopefully are able to do some of those same sorts of things. And the end goal of that for me would be that the system can then interact with people and make the conversation ultimately more interesting, or maybe go in slightly different directions than it would have without the machine. So in the mathematical domain, the idea would be that it would develop the subject itself in a new way. It would contribute to mathematics itself. And of course, there's lots of other work in other domains going on at the same time.
And is there any kind of conflicts that you've found in investigating that?
So do you mean conflicts from people not wanting the system to be called creative?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so there's certainly opposition to it. It's quite a controversial thing to want to do. Some people worry that we're maybe cheapening the notion of creativity or trying to replace humans doing, you know, what's usually quite an interesting job. So they think, you know, computers are okay to replace drudgery or things that we don't want to do, but creative tasks are the things that we do want to do. So we don't want the computers doing those. And to me, the answer to those points is I certainly don't think it cheapens it. I think we're looking into what's essentially quite a mysterious phenomenon. But we're trying to examine it, and to me that adds interest rather than taking away interest. And I don't think we're going to find one grand algorithm that will produce all creative behaviour. You know, there's lots and lots of different processes, different ways of thinking, ways of producing new ideas, and so on. And there'll be different corresponding computational algorithms for all of those things. And I think it's really uncovering the mystery of how we create things, to me, is quite fascinating and adds value to it rather than taking away value.
So you said about how once the artificial intelligence is thinking in a creative way, that is it the goal that it works in partnership with us?
So so for me that is the goal, but other people have other goals. So some people want to build systems that are autonomously creative. They don't work in collaboration with people. They develop something, maybe a picture or a poem, and then they will evaluate it as well. So as well as generation and computational creativity, evaluation is an important aspect. So the machine has to recognize when it has created something good, and also probably explain or give a bit of context to the viewer or the audience as to how this has been created, why it's interesting, what it means maybe. So a little bit of context, because in the human situation, we normally don't just have artifacts kind of popping up. We have creators behind them and the backstory, and we want to know about those people and what they were thinking at the time and how they've done something. So we're trying to build that same functionality into our systems.
Now, I think this is totally amazing, and it does sound complete sci-fi, but it's so exciting as to the possibilities as to what could happen with it. How far have you got with this?
Well, we've got to the point where computers can create things which are of interest to experts in the domain. So whatever the systems do, that's normally interesting to us in the computational creativity community. But one of the tests that we use is whether those artifacts are of interest to people in the domain in which they're working, if they're poems or music, or for me, mathematical concepts. Are other poets, musicians and mathematicians interested in them, regardless of how they've been created? And that's happening to a certain extent. So there've been, for example, concerts have been put on where the music has been composed by machines. There was a musical last year called Beyond the Fence that was, as much as possible, it was composed automatically. So the seed idea for it was generated automatically, and the music and the lyrics and some of the choreography, I believe.
That's amazing.
Yeah, people go and see this. I don't think it was the best musical in the world, but it was.
You're not selling this, Alison.
So we're getting to the point where computers are certainly generating artifacts of interest to us. But I don't think we're yet at the point where people would say, yes, they've been creative. So there's still a bit of a jump for us. And
is the future that we might see this working in partnership maybe with students in the classroom when it comes to learning?
Yes, so I think that it could be used to aid learning, or it would be interesting for students to start thinking about the subject itself, I think, and how they might approach it, because it's a very young subject. We've only been going for about 20 years or so. You compare that to maths, which is thousands of years old, we need fresh perspectives, I think. So teaching students an introduction to some of the artificial intelligence methods that we use, or some of the systems in computational creativity, some of the different disciplines and ways of thinking about creativity, or what they think it is, or how they think we might test it. I think that would be a really nice introduction for students in secondary school. I think primary school, that would be quite difficult, but in secondary school, I could see them starting to think about these issues. And I think alongside this, I think you hinted at this earlier, the ethics of what we're doing as well, I think needs to go hand in hand. So with all new science and new technology that's been developed, I think we need to have a program of the ethics of that thing, to make sure that we're, thinking properly about the direction that we want society to go in, I guess, and putting any appropriate bounds on that we need to.
And you said about how do we think about creativity? People have, or students that I've certainly worked with, and obviously I'm coming from a secondary perspective, have very different views about what creativity is. Some automatically assume that it's all to do with the arts and performing arts and music, and that is the creative aspect of it. But then obviously I come from a business background, and from my perspective, creativity is ways in which you think creatively about a problem, so to be novel with an idea. So when you said about how do we think about being creative, where are you in that?
So I try not to define it if possible. I think it's a difficult thing to pin down, and I actually see that as a good thing, because I don't see it as a static phenomenon, but it's a social construct in a way that we will decide whether to attribute something with creativity, and if it's a dynamic concept, then it's an engine for change and progress in society. So I'm glad that we don't all agree on what it is. But having said that, there are certain characteristics that you would look for. And as I said, the generation of something or other is a necessary but not sufficient condition. And that thing normally has to be interesting in some way, valuable and so on, and novel, as you said, novel, surprising. And then there's the processes by which you've come to generate those, this artifact, and then how you evaluate it. And now you might be using different evaluation criteria from other people, and that's even more interesting if you've invented your own evaluation criteria as well. So alongside that, you then need you need to be able to explain what you've done to other people for them to appreciate that, yes, it's creative and yes, it's a good thing. And obviously in the human context, that quite often doesn't happen, and maybe until after they've died or something, or you starving artists that were never appreciated in their lives, but then afterwards everyone thinks they were geniuses. So it takes a long time sometimes for an audience to appreciate something, but at some point that has to be the case, I think, for it to be attributed with creativity.
And you said about the ethics surrounding it. So what do you mean by that in relation to computational creativity?
I would like to see in schools people thinking a little bit philosophically about the issues that are surrounding us in society, and in particular, alongside learning about progress that we're making in science, learning about philosophical and legal checks and bounds on science, and maybe a history of that, and ideas on what we might want to do in the future, so that people are primed to think about that. It is a valid concern that people might say, if you make the computers too smart, then we'll lose our jobs, and we can't just laugh it off. I think, it's a valid thing for them to say. And I think scientists have a responsibility to consider the possible consequences of what they're doing in society. And obviously we all hope it will have good consequences, and often we just don't really know. But I think we should at least be thinking about those ethical sides, and I think starting people doing that in secondary school, where they are getting a science education, starting them having that sort of philosophical education at the same time, I think would be really useful.
It's quite difficult to get them to think, though, philosophically about some issues, because I think sometimes putting it into context for them can be quite difficult, because you're trying to look at, even you just said there, the philosophical, the legal issues surrounding it. It's quite big thinking, isn't it?
Yeah, certainly. They're not easy. They're not easy at all for anyone. And I think in general that the order in which things tend to happen is that first you get the science fiction that sort of has this nice story about some crazy wacky idea. Then you have the science in which the crazy wacky idea actually comes to fruition, or some version of it. And then trailing behind that, you have the philosophy, which is, saying, hang on a minute, this isn't quite right. This isn't really within the bounds of what we want to be allowing people to do. And if the science and the philosophy could be brought more into conjunction with each other, I think that would be a good thing. But yeah, it's very difficult. But I think that secondary school students are certainly capable of learning how to philosophize, and that's what's required. They do in other countries anyway.
I can't wait for Beam Me Up Scotty. I'm just so desperate for that. So, Alison, if we were going to think about teaching computational creativity more in the classroom, you've touched on thinking of the characteristics of creativity and the ethical debate surrounding it. You obviously have a lot of experience and at a high level of thinking about this. So how could we begin to introduce it into schools? We have computer science in schools, but I don't think, I might be wrong, that they go into this level of, creative thinking. So how could we start doing that?
You could start by asking the students what they think creativity is, or maybe giving them examples and asking them to say whether they think that's creative or not, and what do they need to know in order to make a judgment, and are they agreeing with each other, or do they have very strongly different points of view, for example. So start getting them thinking about what it is. And then maybe what it requires. So if there is some example that they all agree, yes, that was a very creative thing to do, try to break that down into as small a chunk as possible, and then start thinking, is there anything about that creative act that could be automated, even just a tiny little thing, and kind of start very low level and try to build it back up and think, is there any point at which you definitely couldn't automate this bit, but you could automate everything else, and if so, why? And I mean, I realize that the idea of automation is that's something else to teach. So I think that you would do by just take a very simple task like brushing your teeth, or something that people do every day, and asking them to break that down and essentially write an algorithm for it. So you'd need to teach the concept of an algorithm, which is a recipe in a way, a kind of a set of processes in a particular order that has to occur, and you've got an input at the beginning, and then outputs are being passed around, and at the end you have a final output maybe. So have them write an algorithm for something very simple, and then try to think, what would that mean for a creative act once you've broken it down? So that would be one thing to do. Another thing would be get them actually playing around with systems that are already available. They could use them. They could read some of the work that's been written. I mean, there's lots of resources, books and papers and so on. So they could start by reading those and having a discussion about whether they think computers can be creative or not. There's the motivation behind it. So whether they think it can teach us anything about the human brain, or whether they think it's a purely engineering approach where we're building useful systems, but it doesn't actually help us to know how we ourselves are creative, and so on. I think you can have some really great discussions with them. And eventually, if they were advanced students, you could get them to do some programming for some small thing that we probably wouldn't say was creative just yet, but, would form the basis of something later on.
Now, quite a lot of what you've just said there resonates with me, because I teach ICT at Key Stage 3, and they, when you were talking about automating it and building in a process, I mean, we've very much done things like flow charts to break down that process and think about how it would work, and would it be effective if we were trying to automate that process. And I'm just thinking back to earlier where you were talking about the different domains, about where this could exist. So it doesn't necessarily, I mean, I know it all interlinks together, but it doesn't necessarily have to stay within computing, does it? I mean, it could actually exist within other subject areas.
Oh, yes, certainly. I mean, this is definitely a multidisciplinary area. So it involves also psychology, philosophy, cognitive science, artificial intelligence, of course, and other areas, sociology, politics, even. It's very much interdisciplinary.
I mean, I can just see many schools and colleges run kind of like enterprise days, or days where students are taken off timetable to, specifically focus on an area. I mean, you could bring all those disciplines into one day where you're focusing on developing something.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic if at the end of the day they had a system which did something, I think, and they had all worked together to build that system. And they, in fact, if they had defined the system in the morning, so they had actually specified the functionality it would have to have, and then designed it in order to have that, and then built it, then that would be a fantastic thing for them to have done, I think.
You've got my brain going now, Alison. I'm thinking about doing this.
So I think, for me, the main three things in computational creativity is that it can generate something. And that thing, it could just be a tweet, it could be anything, but just there's a little thing, an artifact that's been created. It can evaluate it. So usually it generates more than one, and it can tell you between them which one it thinks is better. And then the other one is slightly optional, but it can tell you a little bit about how it made that thing and why it thinks it's good.
Oh, so exciting, all of this. So if you were to recommend a go-to resource that if we wanted to explore it further and is really useful, what would you say is the best place to go to?
Yeah, so I think the best site would be a website, computationalcreativity.net. It's all one word or lowercase. And on that, we have all of our conferences and other events that we hold, lots of resources, books, all of our papers and so on. And there's a teaching page as well for how people might start to teach it, all resources for that, contacts and so on. So that's definitely the best central address. We've been holding international conferences now for 8 years. Well, this is the 8th year just coming up now, and workshops before that. And it has most of the proceedings on it from all of those.
That's fantastic. And I'll put a link to that on your podcast page at inspirationforteachers.com. So, Alison, thank you so much for joining me on this episode. It's been really fascinating exploring this with you. And if any of our listeners wanted to connect with you and explore it further, how could they reach you?
So the best way would be via email. That's Pease, Pease, @dundee.ac.uk. And I'd be really delighted to hear from anyone.
Excellent. Thank you so much for being our expert on the show today, Alison. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for having me. It's been good to talk to you.